Just one night in the barn, the obese woman pleaded. The rancher saw the 4-year-old she hid. Jacob Harrison was closing his barn for the night when he heard her voice, soft and desperate in the winter darkness. "Please, sir. Just one night in the barn. Just one night." He turned and his heart stopped. Standing in the snow was Ruth, the girl he'd loved since they were children, the girl who'd vanished without a word nearly 5 years ago. She was heavier now, shivering in a threadbare shawl, her eyes filled with fear and something else he couldn't name. "Ruth!" His voice broke on her name. She flinched at the sound. "Please, Jacob. I know I have no right to ask. But just tonight. Just the barn. I'll be gone by morning." There was a time when childhood sweethearts were promises made under oak trees and sealed with carved initials, when a girl's reputation was everything and a man's word was sacred, when love grew slowly over years of shared schoolhouse benches and Sunday church socials and stolen glances across dinner tables when families gathered to help with harvests. Jacob's mind was spinning. He'd looked for her for months after she disappeared, rode to every neighboring town, asked every traveler if they'd seen her. And now here she stood, asking for his barn like she was a stranger. "Come inside," he said, stepping toward her. "You're freezing. There's stew on the stove, a fire." But Ruth stepped back, shaking her head violently. "No, please. Only the barn. I can't, I won't impose more than that." Her voice cracked. "Please, Jacob." He wanted to demand answers. Wanted to shake her and ask where she'd been, why she'd left, why she'd broken his heart without even a goodbye. But the look in her eyes stopped him. Pure desperation, the kind that came from having nowhere else to turn. So he nodded, jaw tight. "The barn. But I'm bringing you blankets. And food." She whispered her thanks and hurried inside before he could say more. Jacob stood in the snow, staring at the barn door she'd just closed, his chest aching with 5 years of unanswered questions. The wind bit at his face, but he barely felt it. Ruth. After all this time. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. What he'd say, what she'd say, whether he'd be angry or relieved. But standing here now, all he felt was the weight of those missing years pressing down on him like stones. Then he went to the house, gathered every blanket he could find, filled a plate with stew and bread, and brought it all to her. She was huddled in the corner farthest from the door, and when he set the food beside her, she ate like she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. He watched her for a moment, this woman who'd once been the girl who baked him apple pies and laughed at his terrible jokes, now hollow-eyed and worn. Her hands trembled as she held the spoon. Her dress, he noticed now, was patched in several places, the hem muddy and frayed. "Ruth," he started, but she wouldn't meet his gaze. "Please. Just let me stay tonight. I'll answer your questions in the morning. I promise." Her voice was barely audible, and there was something in it. Not just exhaustion, but fear. Deep, bone-tired fear. So he left her there, but sleep wouldn't come. Hours passed. Jacob lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside, thinking of Ruth alone in the cold barn when there was a warm house right here. It made no sense. None of it made sense. Why had she come back now? Why only the barn? What was she running from? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, giving him no peace. He thought about the way she'd flinched when he said her name, the way her eyes had darted to the shadows as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from them. And then he heard it, a sound cutting through the wind. A child's voice, small and frightened, followed by deep, rattling coughs that made Jacob's chest tighten. His heart lurched. He threw on his coat and boots and ran to the barn, pushing the door open. "Ruth, what?" And then he saw. She was kneeling in the hay, holding a little boy in her arms, rocking him gently, whispering soothing words. The boy was maybe 4 years old, with dark curls plastered to his fevered forehead, his small chest heaving with harsh, wet coughs. His face was flushed red with fever, and even through the sickness, Jacob recognized those features. His own eyes staring back at him through a haze of illness, his dark hair, the shape of his nose and chin. Jacob stared, his mind racing, doing the math. Nearly 5 years since she left. The boy looked 4, maybe just turned 4. Which meant she'd been pregnant when she disappeared. Pregnant with his child. And she'd never told him. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Jacob gripped the barn door to steady himself, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The boy coughed again, his small body convulsing with the effort, and Ruth held him tighter, tears streaming down her face. "How old is he?" Jacob's voice was barely a whisper. Ruth held the boy tighter, her face pale and wet with tears. 4. His name is Samuel. The boy coughed again, a deep, rattling sound that seemed too big for such a small chest. "He's been sick," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. 3 days now. The fever won't break." And Jacob knew 2 things at once. That baby was his, and he was dying. Jacob couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. He stared at the child, at Samuel, who was looking up at him through fevered, half-closed eyes. His son. He had a son. And that son was dying. "I need a doctor," Jacob said, his voice hoarse. "Now." Ruth's face crumpled. "I don't have money for her," but Jacob was already moving. "Stay here. Keep him warm. I'll be back." He ran through the snow to Doc Miller's house and pounded on the door until the old man appeared, bleary-eyed and irritated. "Jacob Harrison, it's past midnight. My son is dying," Jacob said, and the words felt strange and true and terrifying all at once. "Please. Come now." Doc Miller didn't ask questions. He grabbed his bag and followed Jacob through the darkness to the barn. Ruth looked up when they entered, her face streaked with tears, Samuel limp in her arms. The doctor knelt beside them, pressed his hand to the boy's forehead, listened to his chest. The silence stretched unbearably long. Finally, Doc Miller sat back on his heels. "Pneumonia. Advanced. The boy needs medicine, quinine, and a tincture I can prepare. But it's expensive, Jacob. $20 at least." "I'll pay it," Jacob said without hesitation. "Whatever it costs." The doctor nodded and left to prepare the medicine. Jacob knelt beside Ruth in the hay, and for the first time he really looked at Samuel, at this small, fragile boy who carried his blood, his face, his name that he'd never known existed. Ruth was rocking him gently, whispering words Jacob couldn't quite hear. There was a time when a young man courted a girl by helping her father mend fences, when stolen moments in barns during thunderstorms were all the privacy young lovers could find, when promises whispered in the dark were meant to last forever. Jacob remembered Ruth at 14, bringing him lunch at the schoolhouse, sandwiches wrapped in cloth, still warm. He remembered walking home together through the fields, their hands almost but not quite touching. He remembered sitting on her porch swing while her father watched from the window, talking about the life they'd build someday. And he remembered that summer storm, when they'd taken shelter in this very barn, when they'd been young and desperate and certain they'd spend forever together. Doc Miller returned an hour later with the medicine. "Give him this every 4 hours. Keep him warm. The fever should break in 2 days if it's going to break at all." He looked at Jacob meaningfully. "If it doesn't break, bring me back." Jacob paid him from the cash box in his house, nearly everything he had saved. The doctor left, and Jacob and Ruth were alone with their son. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jacob asked quietly. Ruth wouldn't look at him. "Your mother found out I was pregnant. She came to my house. Called me a whore. Said I'd trapped you." Her voice broke. "She said if I didn't leave town, she'd make sure my father lost his job at the mill. That my sisters would never find husbands because of the shame I'd brought. She said if I really loved you, I'd disappear and let you have the life you deserved." "And you believed her?" Jacob's voice was raw with grief. "What choice did I have? I was 19, pregnant, and your mother had all the power. So I left. I went to Silver Creek, told people I was a widow, and I worked as a cook. I raised Samuel alone." Tears streamed down her face. "I gave him everything I could. I told him about you. I showed him your photograph. I told him his papa was a good man who would love him if he could. I would have, Jacob whispered. I would have married you. Fought for you. All of it. I know, Ruth sobbed. But she would have destroyed you. And I couldn't let that happen. She looked down at Samuel. He got sick 3 days ago. The fever came so fast. The doctor in Silver Creek said he needed medicine I couldn't afford. He said without it, Samuel would die. Your town was the closest with a real doctor. I thought I could work, earn money, get the medicine, and leave before you ever knew. I never meant to tell you about him. I never meant to burden you. Jacob felt like his heart was being torn in two. 5 years. 5 years of his son's life, gone. But before he could respond, they heard footsteps outside. The barn door opened. Dawn light spilled in, and Caroline stood there in her fine cloak, her face pale with shock. She must have seen Doc Miller leaving. Her eyes took in the scene, Jacob kneeling in the hay beside Ruth, the sick child between them, the intimacy of the moment. Jacob. Her voice was ice. What is this? Jacob stood slowly. Caroline. This is Ruth. And this, he looked down at Samuel, is my son. Caroline stared at the boy, at his dark curls, his features that mirrored Jacob's so perfectly. Understanding dawned cold and hard. She turned without a word and left, and Jacob knew exactly where she was going. To tell his mother. To tell the town. I'll leave as soon as Samuel can travel, Ruth whispered. I never meant to burden you. You're not going anywhere, Jacob said firmly. He's my son. You're staying. Your mother. Your fiancé. The town. I'll ruin everything for you again. Let me worry about that, Jacob said. Samuel needs care. That's all that matters now. But as the sun rose over the barn, Jacob knew the truth. By noon, the whole town would know Ruth was back with his illegitimate child. And everything was about to fall apart. 3 days passed like a slow-burning fire. Samuel's fever broke on the second night, leaving him weak and pale but breathing easier. Jacob brought medicine every 4 hours like clockwork, along with warm broth, fresh bread, and blankets that Ruth tried to refuse but eventually accepted. Doc Miller came daily, checking the boy's lungs, nodding with cautious approval. He's strong, the doctor said on the 3rd day. Another week and he'll be running around like nothing happened. But it wasn't the medicine that filled those days, it was the waiting, the watching. Ruth stayed in the barn, sleeping in the hay beside Samuel, refusing every offer Jacob made to move them into the house. I can't, she'd say, her voice small and ashamed. It wouldn't be right. So Jacob came to them instead, spending every free moment in that barn, learning his son. Samuel was shy at first, clinging to his mother, watching Jacob with those wide, familiar eyes. But slowly he warmed. On the 3rd day, he showed Jacob a carved wooden horse, worn smooth from years of small hands. Mama made it, Samuel said proudly. She says horses are strong and brave like my papa. Jacob's throat tightened. Your mama's right. Samuel smiled then, a small, tentative thing. Are you the nice man who brought the medicine? I am, Jacob said. And he stopped, not knowing how to say it. But Samuel said it for him. Mama says you're my papa. Meanwhile, the town erupted. Caroline had told her family that very morning, and by noon, everyone knew. Ruth Meadows had returned after 5 years with an illegitimate child, Jacob Harrison's child, and Jacob was paying for everything. The gossip spread like wildfire through the church, the general store, the saloon. Some people remembered young Jacob and Ruth, remembered how they'd loved each other, remembered how heartbroken Jacob had been when she disappeared. Those people whispered sympathetically. But others, those who cared more about propriety than love, were scandalized. An unwed mother. A bastard child. Jacob Harrison's good name, ruined. On the 4th day, Jacob's mother came. She arrived at dawn, her face twisted with a fury so cold it could freeze blood. She threw open the barn door without knocking, and Ruth scrambled to her feet, instinctively putting herself between the woman and Samuel. "You," Jacob's mother hissed. "You dare come back here? After everything?" Ruth lifted her chin, though her hands trembled. "I didn't come back for you. I came back because my son was dying." "Your bastard, you mean?" The word hung in the air like poison. Jacob, who'd been in the house getting breakfast, came running at the sound of raised voices. He arrived just in time to hear his mother's next words. "I paid you to stay away. I gave you money. And still, you came crawling back." Jacob froze. "You what?" His mother turned to him, her face flushed. "I did what was necessary to protect you. After she left, I sent her money. To make sure she could survive, to make sure she'd stay gone." She turned back to Ruth. "And you took it. You took my money and now you dare return?" Ruth's voice shook but didn't break. "I took it once. $50. For Samuel's birth. The midwife cost money I didn't have. But after that, I refused every letter you sent. I didn't want your money. I wanted to raise my son with dignity." Jacob felt the world tilting. His mother had known where Ruth was all along. Had been in contact with her. Had tried to keep her away. "You knew," he said quietly, his voice dangerous. "You knew where she was. You knew about Samuel. And you said nothing." His mother lifted her chin. "I protected you from a mistake that would have ruined your life." "That mistake," Jacob said, his voice shaking now, "is my son. His name is Samuel. And you kept him from me for 5 years. And I'll keep doing what's necessary," his mother snapped. "Send her away, Jacob. Or I'll cut you off from everything. The inheritance. This ranch. Your engagement. All of it." Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Caroline appeared in the barn doorway. She looked immaculate as always, her composure perfect, but her eyes were cold as winter ice. "Jacob," she said calmly, "might I have a word?" They stepped outside, leaving Ruth and his mother in tense silence. Caroline didn't waste time. 3 more days, she said. "Get rid of that woman and her child, or our engagement is over. My father won't do business with you. No one will. You'll lose everything." "Caroline, I'm not finished. I've been patient. I've been understanding. But I won't be humiliated further. Choose, Jake. Me and your future, or her and your past." She left before he could answer. Jacob stood in the snow, the weight of it all crushing down on him. Inside the barn, he could hear his mother still berating Ruth, could hear Samuel crying softly. He went back inside and knelt beside the boy. "It's all right," he said gently. Samuel looked up at him with teary eyes, then reached into his mother's bag and pulled out a photograph, creased and worn from being handled so many times. It showed Jacob at 19, standing at the harvest festival, grinning at the camera. "Mama says you're my papa," Samuel whispered. "Are you?" Jacob looked at this little boy, his little boy, and felt something break open in his chest. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "I'm your papa." Samuel threw his arms around Jacob's neck, and Jacob held him, this child he'd only just met but would die to protect. On the 5th day, Samuel was well enough to travel. Ruth packed their few belongings with shaking hands. "We should go," she said quietly, "before this gets any worse." But when she took Samuel's hand to leave, the boy pulled free and ran to Jacob, wrapping his arms around Jacob's legs. "No, Mama. I don't want to go. Please don't make us go, Papa." Jacob lifted Samuel into his arms and looked at Ruth, really looked at her. At the exhaustion in her eyes, the strength it must have taken to survive 5 years alone, the love she had for their son. And he knew he couldn't let them leave. Not again. "I'm taking you both to the church social tomorrow," Jacob said quietly. "The whole town will see. I'm claiming you. Both of you." Ruth's face went pale. "Jacob, you'll lose everything." He met her eyes. "I already lost everything once when you left. I won't lose you again." The Christmas church social was the biggest gathering of the year, the entire town crammed into the decorated hall, children running between tables, the smell of pine and cinnamon thick in the air. Jacob walked through that door with Ruth on one side and Samuel on the other, and every conversation died mid-sentence. Every head turned. The silence was deafening. Jacob felt Ruth trembling beside him, felt Samuel's small hand grip his tighter. But he kept walking, kept his head high, until he stood in the center of the room where everyone could see. His mother stood near the refreshment table, her face going white with shock. Caroline was there too, surrounded by her family, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes burning with betrayal. "Some of you know Ruth," Jacob said, his voice carrying over the silence. "We grew up together. She left town nearly 5 years ago." He paused, looked down at Samuel. "And this is Samuel. He's 4 years old. He's my son." The whispers exploded, gasps, scandalized murmurs, a few people shaking their heads in disgust. But Jacob kept talking, his voice steady and clear. "Ruth left because my mother threatened her family. Threatened to have her father fired, to make sure her sisters could never marry, to run them all out of the territory. She left to protect them. To protect me. And she raised our son alone for 5 years while I had no idea he existed." His mother pushed through the crowd, her face purple with rage. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you air our family's shame in front of everyone?" "It's not shame," Jacob cut her off. "It's the truth. You drove her away. You kept my son from me. And you've spent 5 years lying to me about it." "I saved you," his mother spat. "From a life of embarrassment. From being shackled to a fat cook's daughter who would have ruined everything we've built." The cruelty in her voice made several people flinch. But Jacob's voice stayed calm. "You didn't save me from anything. You destroyed the only thing that ever mattered." Caroline stepped forward then, her composure finally cracking. "So that's your answer," she said coldly. "You're choosing her. After everything." Jacob turned to her, and for the first time, he felt nothing but regret for the time he'd wasted pretending. "I'm sorry, Caroline. You deserve someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. But that person isn't me. It never was." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the engagement ring he'd been carrying, and held it out to her. "I can't marry you. I won't." Caroline stared at the ring for a long moment, then slapped it out of his hand. It clattered across the floor, and no one moved to pick it up. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice shaking. "My father will make sure you never do business in this town again. You'll have nothing." "I know," Jacob said quietly. His mother stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. "If you do this, if you claim that woman and her bastard, you are no son of mine. I will cut you off. You'll lose the ranch, the inheritance, everything." Jacob looked at her, this woman who'd raised him, who'd controlled every aspect of his life for 25 years. And he felt something inside him finally break free. "Then I'll have nothing," he said. "But I'll have them." The room erupted in chaos. Some people stood and applauded, those who remembered young Jacob and Ruth, who'd seen how much they loved each other, who believed love mattered more than scandal. But others stood and walked out, shaking their heads in disgust, pulling their children away as if Ruth's presence might contaminate them. The town split down the middle, right there in that church hall. Jacob's mother stood frozen, staring at him like she'd never seen him before. "You would choose them over your own family?" "They are my family," Jacob said. He looked down at Samuel, who was watching everything with wide, frightened eyes. Then he looked at Ruth, who was crying silently, her hand over her mouth. "They're my family, and I'm claiming them." His mother's face went hard as stone. "Then you are dead to me." She turned and walked out, her back rigid with fury. Caroline followed, her family trailing behind her, and half the town went with them. The door slammed shut, and the remaining people stood in awkward silence. Jacob knelt down in front of Samuel. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. The boy nodded, then threw his arms around Jacob's neck. "You're really my papa," he whispered. "Really, truly?" Really, truly, Jacob said, his voice breaking. He stood, lifting Samuel into his arms, and held out his hand to Ruth. She took it, her fingers cold and trembling, and together they walked out of that church hall into the winter night. Behind them, the town buzzed with gossip and judgment and shock. But ahead of them was only darkness and uncertainty. Jacob had made his stand. He'd claimed his son, chosen Ruth, lost everything his mother had promised him. And now, he had no idea what came next. The letter arrived 6 days after the church social. Jacob was in the barn mucking stalls when Ruth came running, her face pale with terror. "Jacob," she gasped, holding out the official-looking envelope. "It's from a lawyer. Your mother, she's filed a legal claim for custody of Samuel." Jacob's blood ran cold. He tore open the letter and read. His mother was petitioning the court to grant her custody of Samuel Harrison on the grounds that the child was the illegitimate grandson of the Harrison family, that his mother was unfit due to her unwed status and lack of means, and that the child's future would be better served in the care of his lawful grandmother. A hearing was scheduled for the following week. "She can't do this," Ruth whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She can't take him from me." But Jacob knew she could. Samuel had been born out of wedlock. Jacob had no legal claim to him. And his mother had money, power, and the law on her side. He grabbed Ruth's hands. "She won't take him. I promise you she won't." "How can you stop her?" Ruth sobbed. "You have no legal right to him. We're not married. The law doesn't recognize you as his father." Jacob looked at her for a long moment, then dropped to one knee right there in the barn. "Then marry me," he said. Ruth's eyes went wide. "Jacob, marry me," he said again. "Not because of this. Not because we have to. But because I love you. Because I've loved you since we were children and I never stopped. Because you're the bravest woman I've ever known and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. But also," his voice broke, "because I need to be able to legally protect our son." Ruth was crying too hard to speak, but she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." They married 2 days later in a ceremony so small it barely counted. Just the preacher, Doc Miller, and 2 neighbors who'd stood by them. Samuel stood between them, holding the rings, grinning so wide his face might split. And when the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Jacob pulled Ruth close and kissed her like he'd wanted to for 5 years. But there was no time to celebrate. The hearing was in 3 days. The courtroom was packed. Jacob's mother sat at the front with her lawyer, a sharp-faced man from the city who looked at Ruth like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. Ruth sat beside Jacob, her hand clutching his so tight her knuckles were white. Samuel sat between them, quiet and confused. The lawyer stood. "Your Honor, Mrs. Elizabeth Harrison is here today seeking custody of her grandson, Samuel. The boy was born out of wedlock to a woman of no means and questionable morals. Mrs. Harrison can provide the child with education, opportunities, and a future his current guardians cannot." Jacob's lawyer, a younger man, less polished but honest, stood to respond. "Your Honor, Samuel's parents were married 4 days ago. Jacob Harrison is the boy's biological father and legal guardian. The child belongs with his parents." "A marriage of convenience," the city lawyer sneered. "Arranged only to circumvent this custody claim. The child would be better served in the care of his grandmother, who can provide stability, wealth, and proper upbringing." And so it went back and forth until the judge called for witnesses. Doc Miller testified that he'd delivered medicine to Samuel, that he'd seen Jacob care for the boy with genuine love. 2 neighbors testified that they'd seen Jacob with Samuel every day, that the bond between father and son was real and deep. But Jacob's mother's lawyer countered with testimony about the scandal, about Ruth's unwed motherhood, about Jacob's sudden poverty now that he'd been disinherited. Then the preacher stood. He was an old man, white-haired and gentle, and he'd known Jacob since he was a boy. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I have something to say." The courtroom fell silent. 5 years ago, Ruth Meadows came to me before she left town. She was pregnant and terrified. She told me that Mrs. Harrison had threatened her family, threatened to ruin them if she didn't disappear. I counseled her to tell Jacob the truth, but she was too afraid. She left to protect the people she loved. The courtroom exploded in whispers. Jacob's mother stood, her face white. That's a lie. But the preacher wasn't finished. Mrs. Harrison came to me afterward and confessed what she'd done. She asked for God's forgiveness for driving the girl away. I gave her that forgiveness, but I never forgot what she told me. And now she's trying to take that woman's child, and I cannot stay silent. The judge banged his gavel. The room fell quiet. He looked at Jacob's mother, and his expression was cold. Mrs. Harrison, is this true? She opened her mouth, closed it, then sat down without answering. The judge turned to Samuel, who was sitting between his parents, his small hand in Jacob's. Young man, the judge said gently, who do you want to live with? Samuel didn't hesitate. He climbed into Jacob's lap, wrapped his arms around his father's neck, and said, my papa and mama. The judge nodded. Then that's where you'll stay. Petition denied. Jacob's mother stood, her face ashen, and walked out of the courtroom alone. No one followed her. The town had heard the truth, and the truth had shamed her beyond repair. 6 months later, Jacob and Ruth stood in their kitchen, modest but warm, watching Samuel play in the yard with the puppy Jacob had carved him. Ruth was pregnant again, and Jacob's hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly. They'd lost the big ranch, the inheritance, the approval of half the town. But they'd gained everything that mattered. And one cold morning, there was a knock at the door. Jacob opened it to find his mother standing there, older and smaller than he remembered, holding a carefully wrapped gift. May I meet my grandson? She asked, her voice barely audible. Jacob looked at Ruth. She nodded. And slowly, carefully, they began to build something new. Not forgiveness, not yet. But a beginning.